Welcome to Dialogues in Afrolatinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Reed-Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afrolatinidad. Venga. I am delighted to welcome today's guest, Dr. Sherwin K. Bryant. Dr. Bryant is an associate professor of African American Studies and History at Northwestern University. He specializes in the history of the African Diaspora and questions of slavery, race, law, and legal history in Latin America. He is the author of Rivers of Gold, Lives of Bondage, Governing Through Slavery in Colonial Quito, published in 2014, which explores the realities of slavery and slave life in the kingdoms of New Granada and Quito in present-day Colombia and Ecuador. Dr. Bryant is the former director of the Center for African American History at Northwestern and currently serves as the co-director of the Andean Cultures and Histories Working Group in the Weinberg College Center for International and Area Studies. Welcome to the Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction and for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
It's our pleasure. So let's jump right in. So you're from North Carolina. So what was your journey from there to Northwestern, and how did you become interested in examining the experiences of Afro-Latin Americans?
Sure. So I would say that my interest in the study of Afro-Latin America really grows from those early formative experiences in North Carolina. And that's all about a love and a fascination with Black history, right? Which was nurtured in my family, in my community through mentorship programs, Black history competitions, and really the valuing of Black storytelling and my proximity to my ancestors by way of the elders, right? So I was raised around my grandmothers, my grandfathers, my great grandmothers, and great aunts, who all taught me about slavery, our family's relationship or connection to the Civil War, the race massacre in 1898 in Wilmington, which is just across the river from where I'm from in Brunswick County. And really also the story of Black land acquisition in rural Brunswick County, right? So these are all the things that really instilled and nurtured a love and a curiosity for Black history in me. And then I went to North Carolina Central University, historically Black university in North Carolina. And there I found my way to the history department, which looked at history in global perspective. And, but I think the through line was a kind of global comparative Black history. And I encountered a scholar there by the name of Lolita Gutierrez Brockington, who was teaching courses on colonial Latin America. And it was through those courses with Lolita Brockington that I came to read books by, Colin Palmer, Slaves of a White God. And and at that time, a classic in the field. He was teaching at UNC, Chapel Hill, just 20, 30 minutes down the road.
Yes.
And at that time, I didn't even know that about Lolita's first book, which was on the Cortes Haciendas in Tehuantepec. But at the time, she was working on the book that would become Blacks, Indians, and Spaniards in the Eastern Andes. And so the idea that there were Blacks in the Eastern Andes or in Mexico, or even just encountering some of the older works like Ivan Van Sertima's that came before Columbus, those kinds of texts really just really lit a kind of fire, really furthered my curiosity about Black history in Latin America, right? Which seemed so far away and yet so very much related to my upbringing.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, it's really, really beautiful, incredible the way that your family has such a rich, deep influence on that curiosity, on that quest to understand. I know that you're passionate about telling the story of the African diaspora, and especially the relationship to the law. So can you tell me more about that and what drew you to this particular arena? The connection between the law and
Well,
enslavement?
Well, my relationship to that very question, has a kind of security root, right? I mean, the most direct relationship is when I first went to Latin America in 1996 to study Spanish. I became really fascinated. I went to Ecuador. I went to Quito. And I became really enamored with Ecuador and with the landscape and the people, and really curious about that. And at the same time, really frustrated by the kind of narrative of, no slavery in Ecuador, blackness being on the coast. And so when I came back, my dissertation director, Kenneth Andrian, suggested that I might go back and have a look at a section in the archive called Esclavos,
Mhm.
Esclavos
I want to I want to I
Negros.
want to go back just
Yeah.
a second. This narrative, the national narrative that you're running into, that there is no slavery in Ecuador. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you encountered that?
Yeah, so I think that it's a very slippery narrative in the sense that slavery was broadly abolished around 1851 in that region, right? Just as Ecuador was starting to break off and become its own sort of nation state or a kind of republic, right? And
Mhm.
so part of its kind of myth making about itself suggested that slavery was not a part of Ecuadorian history as a nation, right?
I
But there
see.
was also um, this sort of, really important aspect of Black resistance by way of a series of slave shipwrecks that occurred on the coast of what's now Ecuador, near this place called Esmeraldas.
Mhm.
And there, as a result of those shipwrecks, Afro descendant people overthrew their captors and intermarried with local chieftains, indigenous chieftains, and essentially became free and became proverbial governors of that territory, right? And so people would often tell that story in
I
a
see.
very kind of condensed way to say, as a result, there was no slavery here ever, right?
Oh, wow.
Um, and so, obviously, inside of that story is a tale of slavery and slave trading, right?
Exactly.
But there's also a bigger story of slavery that I knew about that I wanted to uncover. But people would always say, oh, no, there was no slavery. You have to go to the coast. You have to go to Esmeraldas, and there you'll learn about Blacks. It's
Wow. I
sort
mean,
of
it's not
code.
an uncommon narrative, this kind of washing away of slavery
That's
itself.
right.
You having some other explanation for why there are Black people
Hmm.
in a particular country in Latin America. So yeah, so I'm
Right,
glad that
right, right.
you were drawn to investigate that, to interrogate that, to break
Yeah,
that narrative
yeah,
down.
yeah, yeah.
So in the work, okay, continue what you were saying about well, you about being drawn to the area
Oh,
and the law.
yeah,
Apologies for interrupting.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, and so I did go back and start doing that research in that particular section of the archive, and what I found there were, among other things, um, a cache of court cases,
Mm,
right, wherein enslaved people, in some instances, were actually suing slaveholders for things like their freedom.
mhm.
If they claimed they had been free, maybe they had purchased their freedom, or due to an arrangement to purchase their freedom. But they were also suing for what was called gross mistreatment. So basically, the Spanish so the legal process left open this possibility,
Mm.
and that really fascinated me. As both, but what fascinated me more so at that time was that through those court cases, I read enslaved people giving testimony. I read them narrating, it seemed to me,
Uh-huh.
an experience that brought them to this legal authority, right? And I was most interested in those voices. So the cases were, at first blush, a way for me to get at their voices, right? The
Right.
question of agency was very palpable at that time in the late 90s when I was in graduate school.
Yeah, no, those, I mean, I'm with you on that. Those kinds of, any kind of cases where you get to hear even a smidgen of their perspective, their agency, their thought processes is incredibly important and rich. And we just, because we don't get to see it all the time. We get to hear
Hmm.
other people
Hmm.
talking around it, but not. It's less common to hear them bringing these suits and saying what they, making their arguments, even if the scribes are involved in putting it
Hmm.
down legibly, but that it is essentially their perspective, their testament, and their quest for justice in that sense. So it is, I mean, I am
Exactly.
amazed by the power of their words and their efforts to find a way to foster justice in this very circumscribed arena. So I'm
That's
just a
right.
fan.
So that that opened up all sorts of thorny methodological issues like how do I use this source and all the ways that you're gesturing towards now, and so that really opened up that interest in law and legal history, in addition to my interest in the African diaspora. Yeah.
So then as a scholar as well as an educator, how do you use your work to contribute to our understanding of Afro-Latin American communities? So for example, in the classroom, what kind of examples do you bring to your students to help them understand? Because I mean, I have a similar issue in teaching my students. It's hard to take them back in time to understand. And so
Hmm.
there are lots of mechanisms to try to get them to understand, help them understand this. And so I'm wondering, what kinds of things do you use to help them understand?
Sure. So I think one of the first things that I want to help students understand is the sort of the long durée of Black history, right? So for me, there's a kind of intervention in what we call Black history, that I'm trying to make that goes before 1619, and that also pivots beyond the 1619, right? So I'm trying to help them see the relationship of the Americas, right? I'm trying to help them see that in fact, 3 out of 4 people who came to the Americas before the year of 1825 were Africans, right?
Exactly.
So helping them to understand that there's a relationship to Iberia, right? Helping them to understand that there's a relation, Spain and Portugal, there's a relationship to sub-Saharan Africa, and that these relationships influence the history of Black life in the Americas, right?
Yes.
So I use, so in some ways, there's a concern for time, right? How do we get back to that,
Hmm.
to these earlier periods, and understanding that the things that we take for granted, or the way that we narrate history, sometimes comes to us from a more recent period, the 1800s, right? And so, what was it like before, and how do we understand how that changed over time, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of interest right now about Blackness, right? So trying to complicate and texture that and give them a sense of that. So I use primary sources, right? One source I like to use is a text called Afro-Latino Voices, because it has different slices of, primary source texts of different Afro-descendant people, right? So one of the things we see were, not all people of African descent who came to the Americas in those early years
Mhm.
were enslaved, right? A good number of
Yes.
them are coming from Spain and Portugal, and are, in these passenger licenses that Leo Garofalo charts, right? So texts like that, a lot of sort of firsthand accounts, so they can begin to get a sense of, who these people were, and the variety of individuals and motivations, that forged people onward.
Absolutely. No, it's great. It's really wonderful to have the students read the words for themselves of individuals, their experiences. I think it can make a big difference between the kind of the lectures that we give and how they engage with this kind of this document directly from the time period that you're talking about.
Hmm.
And then I guess kind of related to that, what do you think are some of the most urgent issues for Afro-Latin American communities, especially today, especially as they relate to your work? You mentioned a little bit about
Hmm.
the narratives, changing of national narratives. I'm not sure what the situation is in Ecuador now, if they're dealing with it in the
Hmm.
curriculum, but just wanted to get your perspective on some of those kinds of pressing issues regarding the Afro-Latin American
Yeah.
community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the most pressing issues are issues of racism and racial exclusion, right? And really the sort of disavowal of that, right? There's been a way in which, that's like that same narrative that I was giving about locating blackness elsewhere, locating it on the coast, right?
Hmm.
There's a kind of geographical marginalization that Afro descendant populations have experienced across the Americas, right? Not just in Latin America, but in Latin America. And so I think that is something that various Afro descendant and indigenous activist groups have worked to counter over the last 30, 40 years, right?
Hmm.
And to the degree that they've situated themselves as and in law in some ways to call for things like ethnoeducation, right? The
Hmm.
ability to see oneself in the curriculum, right? The ability to write the importance of Black history and memory into curriculum, into studies. I think issues like access to healthcare, access to education and services are really urgent. Infrastructure, right? A lot of our communities are sequestered in areas of countries that are not well resourced in terms of the infrastructure. In particular, I think in terms of Colombia right now, we see that violence and ongoing subordination through geopolitical kind of incursion and impoverishment
Hmm.
and displacement um, are the kinds of challenges that continue to impinge upon um, Black life, right? Even as the state celebrates and promotes peace processes,
Right.
there are ongoing sort of removal, displacement, assassination of local indigenous and Black leaders in these territories, right? My work also, I think, seeks to sort of showcase the ways that whatever we mean when we come to call colonial Latin America or even the nation state, many of these territories would never have been claimed by Spain were it not for Afro descendant peoples,
Hmm.
right? So we're talking about uh, palenques or runaway slave communities
Right.
that are really sort of, so this is related to current claims of land and belonging
Hmm.
that Black populations have been calling for. I think most notably in places like Colombia and Brazil,
Hmm.
right, and have been most successful legally in making those kinds of claims for territory, for land, for belonging, given that colonial history
Hmm.
of slavery and slave resistance, right?
Right.
So I think my work is related to those kinds of concerns.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I would say, kind of coming to the close of our conversation, but certainly not the end, and by no means. In addition to your book, Rivers of Gold, Lives of Bondage, Governing Through Slave and Colonial Quito, what other specific resources would you recommend to people who are interested in learning more about this topic or these communities? Are there any
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
films or digital projects or organizations that you would recommend people uh, investigate or do Google searches or try to connect with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that one thing in terms of slavery, I think the Voyages Slave Trade Database is an amazing kind of collection that is being further updated and enriched, particularly with materials from Latin America. So there's a way in which we're only now starting to understand and improve our sourcing on the slave trade to Spanish America, for example, right?
Mhm.
So I think that database is particularly useful and important. I mean, there are a host of sort of books and texts that I would recommend. I mean, I don't know how much time we have in terms of to list them all. But I think in terms of some of the things that I've referenced today, I think I mentioned Afro Latino Voices. There's Becoming Black Political Subjects by Tiana Paschel. And I think in terms of Brazil, for something a little bit that pivots in both directions, I would suggest Kim Butler's Freedoms Given, Freedoms Won.
Mhm.
And, I think in terms of projects, you might look at the Quinto Suyu, the fifth Suyu, which helps to take us into a concern for the Afro Andes, right, and the history of Africans in the Andes. So that would be a kind of project that I would suggest people look at.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspectives, your journey, your deep commitment to histories. It's been a pleasure, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Dialogues on Afrolatinidad, please subscribe to our podcast and tell a friend. For links to the resources mentioned in the interview, visit our website at michellereedvasquez.com/podcast.